Picture this, December 26, 1947, New York City. The official weather report reads, cloudy with occasional light snow, the most dangerous forecast in the city's history. And this wasn't just a winter storm. This was a claustrophobic nightmare that would hunt, trap, and bury the world's busiest metropolis like nothing before or since the Great Blizzard of '47. From the Battery to the Bronx, New York fought against snow that erased landmarks, drifts that swallowed cars whole, and a sky that turned a bruised, heavy purple. For those navigating the concrete canyons, the memory isn't just of the chill. It's of the eerie silence of a city stopped dead, 10,000 abandoned cars, and the realization that nature had conquered the machine. It began deceptively in the morning. The air was crisp with the scent of roasted chestnuts. Men in fedoras rushed to catch the uptown bus. The headline offered no warning. In fact, the tragedy of the Great Snow of 1947 began with the spectacular failure of imagination. At the weather station down at the Battery, meteorologists were looking at maps that suggested a low-pressure system off the coast would drift harmlessly out to sea. They missed the collision. A warm, moisture-heavy front from the Gulf of Mexico was currently slamming into a wall of frigid Canadian air right over the 5 boroughs. At 3 a.m., the first flakes touched the pavement. By 7 a.m., as the city woke up, there was a manageable 2 inches on the ground. To the hardened New Yorker, this was nothing. The subways were running, the 3rd Avenue L was clattering overhead, and the department stores were opening their doors for the post-Christmas sales. But by noon, the mood on the street shifted from annoyance to genuine confusion. The snow wasn't stopping. It wasn't even pausing to breathe. It was falling at a rate of 3 inches per hour, a heavy wet blanket that clung to everything it touched. The trap snapped shut around 2 p.m. This was the era before remote work, before cell phones, before reliable radar. If you were at work, you stayed at work until the whistle blew. By the time office workers in Midtown looked out their windows, they realized the streets below had vanished. The familiar grid of Manhattan was gone, replaced by a churning white sea. Panic set in. A mass exodus began as hundreds of thousands of people poured out of skyscrapers simultaneously, desperate to get home to the outer boroughs before the sun went down. This was the fatal mistake. They were walking directly into the teeth of the storm. On the streets, the scene was chaotic. The heavy rear-wheel drive sedans of the late 40s, massive slabs of Detroit steel, were useless on the untreated ice. You could hear the high-pitched whine of tires spinning freely and the grinding crunch of fenders colliding. Drivers, realizing they were going nowhere, simply opened their doors and walked away. A brand-new Buick, which might have cost someone $1,500, a year's salary for many, was abandoned in the middle of Broadway, rapidly disappearing under a white drift. The public transit system, the lifeblood of the city, began to hemorrhage. The buses were the first to die. They lacked the chains to grip the slick asphalt. One by one, they jackknifed across intersections, blocking the plows that were desperately trying to deploy. Inside the buses, the atmosphere grew heavy with the smell of wet wool, stale cigarette smoke, and rising fear. Commuters were packed shoulder to shoulder, steaming up the windows, watching the snow pile up halfway up the glass doors. There was no checking the app to see when the next bus would come. You just waited, and as the engine died and the heater cut out, the biting cold of 1947 crept in through the thin soles of leather dress shoes. By 5 p.m., the sun had set, and the city plunged into a terrifying darkness. The snow was falling so fast, nearly 26 inches in 24 hours, that the streetlights were obscured. The familiar roar of the city had been suffocated. The only sounds were the howling wind whipping through the avenues and the muffled shouts of men trying to push cars that would not move. The commuter rail lines fared no better. At Penn Station and Grand Central, the crowds were dangerous. It was a sea of fedoras and frantic faces. Trains were delayed, then canceled. The tracks out to Long Island and Westchester were buried. Tens of thousands of people realized simultaneously that they weren't going home tonight. The grandeur of the station terminals turned into refugee camps. People slept on the cold marble floors, wrapped in newspapers, huddled against the radiators. For those brave enough, or foolish enough, to try walking, the city became an alien landscape. Familiar landmarks were erased. A walk from Times Square to the Upper West Side, usually a 20-minute stroll, became a 2-hour polar expedition. The wind chill cut through gabardine coats like a knife. Pedestrians formed human chains, holding on to each other's coattails to avoid getting separated in the blinding whiteout. They climbed over the mounds of abandoned automobiles that littered the streets like sleeping giants. As midnight approached, the realization hit. Nature had conquered the machine. The greatest city on Earth, the symbol of industrial might and 20th century progress, had been brought to its knees by frozen water. The hustle was over. The noise was gone. New York City was about to experience something it had never known before: absolute silence. When the sun rose on the morning of December 27th, it didn't illuminate New York City. It illuminated a new alien landscape that had seemingly replaced the 5 boroughs overnight. The violence of the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of piercing, innocent blue. But down below, the city that never sleeps was in a coma. The silence was the first thing everyone noticed. It was a heavy physical presence. For a generation of New Yorkers born into the industrial clamor of the 20th century, silence was a foreign concept. There was no clatter of the L trains, no roar of delivery trucks, no shouting of street hawkers, and no hum of tires on asphalt. The acoustical dampening of 26 inches of snow turned the concrete canyons into a cathedral. If you stood in the middle of Times Square, you could hear the wind rustling the coating of ice on a marquee 3 blocks away. Stepping out onto the street that morning felt less like walking into a city and more like exploring the aftermath of a Pompeii-style burial. The automobiles that had been abandoned the night before were gone. In their place sat thousands of white, shapeless mounds. You didn't know if a mound contained a luxury Cadillac, a milk truck, or just a pile of trash. They were sleeping elephants, clustered in the middle of intersections and blocking the avenues in chaotic, frozen herds. For the children of 1947, this wasn't a disaster. It was a miracle. The sheer scale of the snowdrifts turned the rigid urban grid into a playground. Teenagers strapped on wooden skis and glided down the center of Fifth Avenue, passing the buried entrances of Saks and Tiffany's. Without the fear of traffic, the streets belonged to the people. Photographs from that day show men in fedoras and women in fur coats walking right down the center line of Broadway, dwarfed by walls of snow that had been plowed up to 12 feet high. There was a brief, surreal sense of community. The rigid social strata of the 1940s melted away slightly. When everyone is stuck, a banker and a bricklayer are just 2 guys trying to find a shovel. But as the novelty wore off around midday, the gritty reality of survival in a frozen metropolis set in. The city was paralyzed, and a paralyzed city starts to starve very quickly. The milk trucks couldn't move. In 1947, refrigeration was common, but the daily delivery was still a lifeline. No milk meant no formula for babies. The coal trucks, responsible for heating the vast majority of tenement buildings and brownstones, were stranded in New Jersey or the outer reaches of Queens. Inside the apartments, the radiators went cold. People huddled in their kitchens, turning on gas ovens to generate a little heat, creating a dangerous cocktail of warmth and carbon monoxide. The fire department was effectively neutralized. If a building caught fire, and with people using kerosene heaters and open ovens, the risk was high. The engines couldn't reach it. Firefighters had to drag hoses by hand, trudging through waist-deep drifts for blocks. The police were reduced to foot patrols, their squad cars uselessly entombed in ice. Then came the Big Dig. It was the largest snow removal operation in the history of the United States. Mayor William O'Dwyer declared a state of emergency, but technology could only do so much. The city had snowplows, but they were designed for a few inches of fluff, not 2 feet of concrete heavy slush. The plows that did venture out often got wedged between the abandoned cars, becoming just another obstacle in the road. The solution, as it often was in the 1940s, was brute human force. The city put out a call for laborers. Anyone with a strong back and a shovel could report to a sanitation depot. The pay was good, $1.10 an hour, about $15 in today's money. It was hard, back-breaking cash. An army of 20,000 men descended on the streets. It was a scene of industrial warfare against the elements. They didn't just shovel, they hacked. The snow had begun to freeze into a solid sheet of ice. On the rail lines, the scene was even more dramatic. To free the frozen switches that directed the trains, workers wielded military-grade flamethrowers, blasting jets of fire at the tracks to melt the ice. The subways, which had been running on limited service, began the slow process of digging out their above-ground sections. The statistics of the removal were staggering. It was estimated that 99 million tons of snow had fallen on the city. To move it, they didn't just push it aside. There was nowhere to put it. They had to load it into trucks and dump it into the East River and the Hudson. A conveyor belt of dump trucks ran day and night, their engines groaning under the weight, dumping dirty, gray sludge into the freezing waters. It took days for the heartbeat of the city to return. The first sign was the sound. The scraping of metal shovels against asphalt, scritch, 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 became the soundtrack of the week. Then came the coughing sputter of engines finally turning over. The sleeping elephants were excavated, revealing the cars beneath, often with dead batteries and flattened tires. By New Year's Eve, the main arteries were clear. The mountains of snow on the sidewalks remained for weeks, turning black with soot and grime, a dirty reminder of the siege. The Great Snow of 1947 didn't just bury New York, it humbled it. It reminded a generation obsessed with progress, speed, and engineering that nature could still simply reach out and turn off the switch. We look back at the Great Snow of 1947 as a romantic, monochromatic memory, a time when the world slowed down. Today we have Doppler radar, heated streets, and satellites that track a single snowflake from the moment it leaves a cloud. We would never be caught off guard like that again, but we have also lost the ability to pause. In 1947, when the snow fell, the world stopped. You didn't have to answer an email. You didn't have to be productive. You just had to survive the cold and shovel your walk. We gained safety, certainly, but we lost the permission to let the silence in.